So now you're going to hear another from three more of our postdoc fellows. It would have been four, but unfortunately Christa Brelsford has a family illness issue that she's dealing with, so she sends her regrets. Our first speaker is Yoav Kallus. He received his PhD in physics from Cornell University in 2011, and he started with us in 2014, so he is a veteran.
So I work on a lot of different packing problems and other stuff, but today, over 5 minutes, I'm going to talk about just some packing problems where you want to have lots of copies of some shape, and you want to figure out how to put them together in the most compact way. And here you have these regular tetrahedra. And one particular problem that I will tell you about today is figuring out what is the worst packing shape. And why do we care about the worst packing shape? Well, the easy answer is that the best packing shape is sort of a trivial question, right? We know we can fill up 100% of space with cubes. And the question is, if we want a more interesting question, we'll ask about the worst packing shape. And there is a conjecture by Stanislav Ulam, who used to hang around these parts, that the ball is actually the worst packing shape. Okay, so packing problems have a really long history in the history of math and science. It goes all the way back to the ancient Greeks, to Plato and Aristotle. And it came up when Plato noticed that there are 5 Platonic solids, 5 regular solids, and he knows there's also 5 elements, so he thought maybe we'll associate a Platonic solid to each of the elements to say that fire behaves the way it does because it's made up of these regular tetrahedra, and they have these sharp corners, so that's why it stings when you touch it. And then Aristotle said, that's ridiculous because these regular solids cannot fill up 100% of space, so your idea is kind of ludicrous, and he said only 2 of them fill up 100% of space. So he talked about the cube and the tetrahedron, but of course he was wrong because the tetrahedron cannot fill 100% of space, and you see that if you try to put 5 tetrahedra around a single edge, then it doesn't fill up the entire space. There's a small space left. Okay, so how do you pack tetrahedra together? So we know we can fill up 100% of space. How much can you fill up? So you can do these simulations on a computer. You fill up a box with some tetrahedra and you let them jiggle around and you compress the box. And if you do it not very carefully and pretty quickly, then you get something disordered, like all the way on the left. But if you do it more carefully and give it more time to equilibrate, then you can end up with a very complex structure that allows the tetrahedra to become more compact. And this is actually a quasi-crystal, turns out. But there is actually another structure that you can make that it's even more compact. And this very simple crystal on the right here. But it turns out that it doesn't form spontaneously. There's sort of kinetic barriers to the structure forming. So it's sort of like Ice 9, if you've ever read Cat's Cradle. And so going back to the question of what is the worst packing shape, so there is this conjecture that the ball is actually the worst. And what I was able to prove that it's a local minimum. So any shape that's close enough to a ball can be packed at a higher density. And this is in contrast actually to so this is very special about 3 dimensions. In other dimensions, this is not the case. So if you look in 2 dimensions, and you ask what is the highest percentage of space that you can fill with circular disks, then this is actually higher than what you can fill with these regular heptagons. And I was also able to show that regular heptagons are also this kind of local minimum. So any small deformations you make on a regular heptagon will give you something that can be packed at a higher density. So the conjecture is that it's actually the absolute worst shape in 2 dimensions for packing. And that's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Yoav. Our next speaker is Artemy Kolchinsky. He received a PhD in informatics from Indiana University in Bloomington in 2015, and that is also the year when he started with SFI.
Hello. So my name is Artemy Kolchinsky. As Jen said, I have a PhD actually in complex systems, or complex systems group, from the School of Informatics and Computing in Bloomington, Indiana, whose beautiful campus is shown here. And the topic of my thesis concerns something called modularity. And broadly speaking, modularity asks how to break down a complex system into its natural subsystems that function relatively independently. At SFI, I work on related topics, and I kind of think of my work as having to do with the intersection of three big themes. One of these is the organization of complex systems and how they're structured internally. The other one is information, how information is processed in biological, social, and physical systems. And the third is actually what constraints physics can tell us about the possible organization and the possible information processing in complex systems. So to give you an example of a project that deals with the intersection of these themes, this is in collaboration with SFI resident faculty David Walpert. And this is a project called Thermodynamics of Computation, or addresses the thermodynamics of computation. What do I mean by this? So there are certain results in physics that state that to perform a computation, to compute some function such as addition here, requires a minimal amount of work, or we can think of it as a minimal amount of energy. For example, as you know, you would have a battery that drives a computational device, such as your computer, and then the energy that goes into that device is then released as heat. But the really fascinating thing is that physics says that there's a minimum amount of heat that must be released no matter what physical device performs a computation. So it could be a silicon chip, it could be some kind of analog computer, it could be a biological brain or a cell or anything at all. There's basically a fundamental bound that has to do with the second law of thermodynamics. So in this project, we're exploring this bound. We're exploring this relationship between what you compute and what you know about it and how much work you need. And we're also exploring various trade-offs to sort of complicate the picture a little bit. For example, if you need to compute within a certain amount of time, so there's a speed constraint, how much more work do you need? And we know that you do need more work to compute faster. What if 2 plus 2 can equal 4.1 or 3.7? So you introduce some error into the computation. We know that actually, in certain cases, you need less work then if you can allow some error. So connecting to the topics that we're talking about here today, there's also interesting applications to biology that we're starting to explore. And this concerns the fact that cells can be thought of as performing, on one hand, metabolism, that is, internal repair and making proteins and digesting food, and they also can be thought of as performing regulation. So there's other networks that regulate metabolism, that take in information from the environment, process it, take decisions, regulate gene expression, and so on. And essentially, these regulatory processes are performing information processing. So they're computations. And just like the thermodynamics of computation applies to any physical device, like I mentioned, it also applies to cells. So in this case, we're trying to ask, and this is the start of a research project, so it's a difficult question, but we're trying to ask, how efficient is the computation done by cells? In other words, how efficiently or optimally do they process information? And in some ways, this is different from some more traditional questions that you might hear, like, how efficiently does a cell do stuff, locomote, or burn up energy, or or make biomass? So we're really talking about a different kind of optimality in a way, because it's really optimality of information processing. So that's my spiel, and if there's any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Thank you.
Thanks, Artemy. And of course, you can track these folks down later as you wish. Our final postdoc speaker is Dan Larremore, who received a PhD in applied mathematics from the University of Colorado at Boulder in 2012, and he started with us last year.
Okay, so I'll tell you about a project that is a little bit different for me. Most of my work tends to be mathematical, do a lot of modeling work, but this is a project that has a lot to do with data. And what we're trying to do is map the patterns of the academic labor market. The academic labor market is pretty weird. In most of the markets that we think about, we have producers and consumers, and in the beginning of any economics course series, you learn about how the producers and the consumers agree upon some price, but they're separate entities, and we think about them as being separate. But academia as a labor market is a little bit different. The same departments that produce PhDs are also hiring PhDs and consuming the PhDs when they're hiring faculty. So to try and understand the structure of this market, we build faculty hiring networks. So here I'm showing you one example network of 10 institutions, the real data from how they trade PhDs in computer science and become faculty in computer science. So all of the arrows are directed flows of people who got a PhD at one place and now became faculty at another. And I've highlighted the flows coming out of MIT so you can see that people from MIT distribute themselves widely into different universities. One of the interesting things about this market is that when I hire somebody at my university from wherever you get your degree from, I'm casting a vote for your university. I'm saying that my department evaluates your department in some way, your credentials in some way, and is casting a vote for those credentials. So the entire system of how the different departments are hiring each other's graduates tells us about how the departments are actually evaluating each other. So what we can do then is take these patterns and form a ranking. This is actually a ranking of prestige, how the departments view each other, instead of an extrinsic ranking like US News and World Report, which they cook up from whatever factors they use. So here are the top 10 in computer science. Again, these are real data. And again, we're creating the ranking based on trading prestige and trading these evaluations. But the full network looks something like this. And when I show you the full network, there are three things that we found immediately. So first, let me explain the picture on the right. Instead of taking this linear ranking that I showed you on the previous slide, I've now wrapped it around a circle. So moving from noon, going clockwise, is decreasing in prestige. What I've done is I've colored all of the flows that are going down the prestige hierarchy from a prestigious PhD into a less prestigious faculty position, blue. And I've colored those that are moving up the prestige hierarchy, red. And if you look at this figure and you see only blue, that's because it's a very systematic set of patterns. 90% of the hiring is going down the hierarchy. Moreover, it's pretty steep. The second fact I'll point out is that fewer than 7% of faculty have a PhD from one of the lower 75% of universities, meaning that the top 25% of universities are supplying over 90% of the faculty that are sitting in the US. One of the fields that we looked at, history, was particularly steep. The top 8 institutions accounted for over 50% of sitting faculty. But moreover, it's biased. We find that the median rank change, the median drop, is 3 ranks lower for women than it is for men. So seeing that the structure here was explained quite a bit by prestige, but that some of the unexplained structure was due to other factors like gender, we became interested in asking, how can we actually model the formation of these networks? What else explains the movements in this market? So we built a predictive model, and this had 3 meritocratic factors. That was prestige, which I showed you an example of on the previous slide. Productivity. We measured the number of papers that each academic had produced when they were on the job market. And then postdoc experience. So we believe these factors are meritocratic. But then we also included 2 non-meritocratic factors, gender and geography. And then what we can do is, from the actual hiring data, look at this map from the candidates that graduate in any particular year to the openings into which they're hired. And we can sever these links and then ask, what mixture of these different factors do we need to put together to most accurately remodel those links? And then we get an understanding of the trade-offs between these particular factors in actually predicting hiring. One of the things that I'll point out is that in computer science, in which only 1 of every 6 faculty members is a woman, we found that women on the job market need to have written about 1 additional paper in order to be placed the same as an equally qualified man. So this kind of gender inequality allowed us to write a grant to the NSF, and with that funding, we're now looking into 3 additional questions, which I'll briefly talk about here. So the first question was, which systematic patterns are consistent across fields? So far, we've looked at computer science, business, and history, and now we're interested in moving beyond that into physics, into the biosciences, and so on. And to do that, we need some new technology. So with Aaron Clausette, who's a computer scientist at University of Colorado, also external faculty at SFI, we're building a web crawler that's using some machine learning techniques to automatically scour the web for the CV data that we then use to build the networks that we analyze. The second question is, do people have an accurate perception of themselves and the system? So perhaps you've seen some of the research about economic mobility in the US, which says that people tend to be more optimistic about their ability to transcend different income brackets over the lifetime than reality says they're actually able to. Statistically, people tend to believe in the American dream, and they're quite sanguine about this sort of thing. So our question is, do people have an accurate perception of their chances in the academic faculty market? Are they also more optimistic in this market? And that's with Mirta Galesic, who is faculty at SFI. And the final question is, how do the policies and culture that create the patterns in the US that create these structures and maintain them, how do they differ if we start to change the cultures and the policies? So with Caterina De Bacco, from her name you can guess she's Italian, who's a postdoc at SFI, we're studying the Italian job. In other words, we're studying the faculty hiring market in Italy to see how the patterns there differ fundamentally from those in the US. So if you have questions or comments, I'd love to chat later, but thanks.